Every year around this time, I enjoy a little chuckle reading the meme that says, if anyone ever asks you, what would Jesus do? Remind them that flipping over tables and chasing people with a whip is within the realm of possibility. But at the same time, I recognize that today's gospel is one of the most important in understanding who Jesus is and what he represents, why he was crucified, and how we are called to live our lives. Last week, we read the story from around the middle of the Gospel of Mark, in which Jesus tells the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and be killed there. Peter admonishes him for this, and then Jesus lashes out at Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And now this week, we have skipped to the second chapter of the Gospel of John. As we've discussed before, the Gospel of Mark is short. He gets to the point and does not spend a lot of time with details, speeches, and side characters. I appreciate Mark for this, having sat through many long-winded lectures and sermons over the years that have left me wondering, what was that all about? But it does make it hard to fill 52 Sundays with readings from his gospel. So we supplement a lot with John, but John does not follow the same timeline as Mark, together with Matthew and Luke, portrays Jesus as living out his ministry over the course of about 3 years. In John's gospel, Jesus' ministry plays out over the course of a single year, one which follows the festal calendar of the Jewish people. All of this is to say that while today's gospel comes from the beginning of John, in the Gospel of Mark, the same temple scene is covered in chapter 11, immediately after the grand entrance into Jerusalem that we read about on Palm Sunday. And most scriptures agree that not only is the chronology of Matthew, Mark, and Luke more accurate, at least in regard to this specific story, but that the flipping of the tables of the money changers and the chasing of the animal sellers out of the temple was the immediate cause of Jesus's crucifixion. Up until that time, Jesus had been generating a little bit of buzz up in Galilee amongst the local religious authorities by challenging their power, healing on the Sabbath, and hanging out with people of ill repute. But Galilee was much like Buffalo in comparison to New York City. People in Jerusalem knew it existed and would hear stories from there now and then, but it really was not an everyday concern. And what happened there did not impact them. By coming into Jerusalem, and most especially by upturning the temple marketplace, Jesus challenged the religious and political authorities directly. To truly understand what Jesus was objecting to and why this was so threatening to those in authority, we need to turn to our first reading in the Law of Moses. Now, when we hear the Law of Moses, or even just the law in the context of the Bible, our minds race to the 10 Commandments that we read this morning. But these commandments are but 10 amongst hundreds of regulations that fall under the title, the law, and fill the books of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. These hundreds of regulations go into great detail as to how to live out the 10 Commandments, and more succinctly, the 2 commandments of Jesus. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. They explain exactly what rituals are required and by whom in order to demonstrate love of God, and what obligations you have to those around you in order to demonstrate love to your neighbor. And in the time and context in which these regulations were written, they demonstrated equanimity and a belief in God that was unique in the world. But the time and context in which Jesus lived was different. And while the regulations governing worship of God were being held to fastidiously, the ones governing treatment of neighbor frequently went unheeded. When the regulations were written, the Jewish people used shekels, which carried pictures of objects, and lived a primarily agrarian life with a heavy emphasis on the herding of livestock. But by Jesus's time, The Roman Empire had imposed the use of denarii, emblazoned with images of their emperors who are worshipped as gods. And most people had long since lost their ancestral lands and turned to being day laborers, craftsmen, fishermen, prostitutes, or beggars to mete out a humble existence. So while bringing one's own livestock to the temple for sacrifice, even if that meant pigeons for the poor, would have been straightforward in an earlier era, in the context of Jesus's time, such livestock needed to be purchased. And as any livestock purchased from non-Jewish sources might be polluted by interaction with unclean livestock or by pagan rituals, purchasing of such livestock from reputable dealers in the temple itself became necessary. Further, such livestock could not be bought using idolatrous currency. So the landless people needed to first trade their denarii for shekels at a rate significantly different from what they could get when they traded their shekels back for denarii that were required for use outside of the temple gates. And then they had to use these shekels to purchase animals that cost more than the similar animals outside the temple gates. In other words, regulations that were written to grant all people the chance to worship God together in dignity, whatever their means, had been so abused that they instead inflicted a regressive tax upon the poorest people. Jesus was not condemning the law. Throughout the Gospels, there are very few instances in which Jesus is portrayed as anything but a firm observer of the law. And in fact, for all of the pages that Paul seems to spend decrying the law, he also seems to have maintained his observance of the law in most respects throughout his life. The law is good. Following the law is good. Condemning murder, theft, and adultery is good. When we just keep doing things because it is what we have always done, but forget why, however, good can be used to hurt and abuse others. What is good and supportive and helps us live a better life in one time and place can hold us back, hurt us, and be bad for us in a different one. As we continue through this Lent, this week we are called upon to reflect upon our own lives and whether there are things, commitments, and habits that we have become beholden to, which at one point in our lives may have helped us to become a better version of ourselves, but which now holds us back. When we find them, to set them aside, to open ourselves to new possibilities that this time and place have brought us, and to learn to live into God, into the love of God and neighbor in new ways. Amen.